So I want to present a very explicit and conscious conceptual unity of opposites, like literally, which I think is a very good analytical tool, sort of a meta-theoretical structure. And the opposites in question, one is a neologism, a word I made up, and the other is a known term, is a prior existing term from Jacques Lacan. So to start with that, that's the quilting point. The point de capitaine, according to Jacques Lacan, is it comes from the actual physical procedure of quilting, in which apparently, I don't know anything about quilting, there is like a physical point at which like you tie up all of the quilt into a singular thing with this exact bit. Like you reach a point where you actually like make it so that it all like stays together as one thing. Before that point, it's a chaos of diverse bits, and then after that point, it is a singular whole. So conceptually, the quilting point is doing that in discourse, in thought, in speech, or whatever. The quilting point is kind of the moment of clarity that that renders this complexity as something that can be known in a determinate way, that it's like tie it all up together and it is this one thing. So the quilting point is like a very important part of kind of any like procedure of theory, any explanation of complexity. Like you present all this diversity of things, which are very overwhelming, and then you have to quilt them. You quilt it all, which is to like enforce theoretically that all of this seeming diversity, this eclectic mess of insights, is in actual fact an utterly unified, singular line of thought. And the quilting point does this. And I mean, how it feels to like to study the thought of a master, to like discover under the tutelage of someone who already knows, is essentially to like revolve around these quilting points. So that's a thing already. And I have a term that I think is very helpful. So the new word, the opposite, is what I like to call Parmenidesization, which is a humorously determined term, which is the exact opposite. If you understand quilting, then like you kind of already will understand what it is to Parmenidesize. So I call it this based on the particular text of Plato's, Parmenides, in which Socrates encounters Parmenides, and kind of unlike basically any other text, like almost any other text, in which it is this, like the ancient sense of dialectical, it's like this battle of perspectives through discourse, through which the truth is like sort of unveiled in this procedural way, in this like debate structure. Parmenides is like not like that at all. Parmenides is just like Socrates encounters Parmenides, and Parmenides kind of just fucking info dumps him like crazy. He just like declares unto him the entire possible diverse structure of like being like according to like the logical possibilities. So I use this word for one because I do actually think that this text demonstrates it. So to Parmenides' eyes is the opposite of a quilt. It is like what I already mentioned. It is that part where you're being overwhelmed with an eclectic mess of diverse ideas that seemingly cannot be unified. So to Parmenides' eyes is to continuously construct like a conceptual like chaos, which continuously is rising in its in the seeming difficulty of a possible quilt. And so, like I said, I call it this because in that text, Parmenides does this to Socrates, essentially. He's just like continuously laying out more and more and more and more in a row in like one big info dump. But I also really like this word because I think the word does itself in a way that I think quilt also does. There's like an onomatopoeic aspect to these words together, which I find hilarious. Because to quilt is like so singular. It's just, that is to quilt. And to Parmenides' eyes is the opposite. It's like, it is overwhelming as a word. It like does itself. And I just find it hilarious, as an aside. But, so, in actual fact, I think there's a kind of generally recognizable rhythm of reason that plays out rhetorically in essentially all discourse, like to varying degrees, which is this unity of these procedures, to Parmenides' eyes and to quilt. That is, to lay out a complex diversity of concepts and then to unify them into an integrated singular force of insight. That is, I mean, you know, sort of logically, it's like necessarily the whole of discourse because they're such meta opposites. So it might seem sort of mundane, sort of overly obvious to say that discourse follows this rhythm because it's like so general. But I think having these terms and just like thinking this way that it has this rhythm can clarify some things. So for one thing, first of all, just that discourse does follow this rhythm, that it like overwhelms and then clarifies. It's like it's a good way to understand the sort of the human sense of communication and learning, and just that it's not a kind of like formally logical procedure like actual communication. Like it just never is. It's not like linear and consistently meaningful, and like you're never just like consistently like on the same page. It just never works that way. It's always this instead. It's like if there is communication to be done, if there's like some sort of meaning to be transferred from a subject to another, it happens this way where like it's completely all over the place and it's like an impossible to summarize mess of all sorts of things that are laid out in a very strange way and just keeps getting worse and worse. And then all of a sudden, in a radical like collecting them all together, suddenly it's all a singular, very simple thing that makes perfect sense and is a very particular and poignant meaning. And all of that always actually made sense, and it was all one thing. And then any further context, like any further like meaning, to the point where like a deeper or a parallel clarity would be needed. To reach that, the same process follows through. Like instead of just like being and also this, it's like all these other fucking things. And then the past clarity might even like fall into being a part of it and seem ambiguous again. But so yeah, this is the rhythm. So so reason follows this sort of this rhetorically bipolar sensibility, right? It's a constantly moving bidirectional thing. In the sense that, like, rhetorically, the Parmenidization and quilting are like direct, mutually exclusive opposites in terms of form. Like, if you are doing one, you absolutely cannot at all be doing the other, and vice versa. They are directly opposite in that sense. They're like formally antagonistic, like methodologically antagonistic. To attempt successfully to do one is precisely to not at all remotely do the other. So, one thing about this, that when you think with these sort of two poles of potential form of argument in mind, one thing about this that it highlights is that I think there are in fact sort of two poles of false ideals of rhetoric, which fall pretty neatly into the culture war of like the right and left sort of personas, like precisely in like shallow characters, like not in any like rigorous treatment of substance, but just in like the unfortunately much more common kind of argument. So there's this kind of there's this sense in which the leftist rhetorician is like addicted to Parmenidization. They have a false ideal of nuance, of complexity, as being raw insight. And so they endlessly just Parmenidize without any real attempt even at effective, clarifying, like unifying, holistic, integrating quilting. They just don't fucking quilt. And they in fact treat quilting as non-nuance. And then inversely, the right wing, sort of again specifically shallow like cultural persona, has the opposite problem, where like they only quilt. They're only after like simple, direct, imminent insight, and they treat any attempt to complexify, to add context and deepen in parallel ways, to form like multilateral kinds of integrated structural form of all sorts of information in one totality. They treat all of that as just like, that's all bullshit, you're just doing bullshit. And again, sometimes this is right, sometimes if they're talking to precisely that kind of left-wing fool, then it is true. They're a fool. It's not proper context. It's not like... It's not complexity directed by insightful unity. But they have the inverse false ideal. They merely quilt and therefore don't quilt, because to quilt requires to work from that foundation of complexity that appears impossible to unify, that appears as this overwhelming monstrosity of complexity, of like interpenetrating, parallel, every which way, above and beneath and beyond raw data. And that is that which is unified into a singular, precise point. That is what it is to quilt. If you quilt in any sense without working from that complexity, that's just like sounding like a teenager discovering weed, basically. It's like you're just saying, like when there's no context, you're just like saying like direct punch statements that are not based on any sort of attempt to tend towards the unification of a complexity. It's just like, puh. that is a false ideal as well. That's not insightful. So the rightist quilts without Parmenidesizing, the leftist Parmenidesizes without quilting, and both are necessarily, as a method of rhetorical, methodological form, incapable of true insight to the degree that they follow this pattern. Because if you do one without the other, you are simply failing to account for and remain, like, you are failing to express fidelity toward the motion of, like, reason itself in the world, like the motion of how, like, perception and thought and practice actually do discover. It's not one or the other. It can't be. It just can't be, because it's to do with how we are limited in terms of working with data and interpreting data and formulating speculatively and then working from that speculation and known anything and all this stuff. There's just, like, there's uncertainty at all levels. There's ambiguity at all levels. And that's not to say that knowledge is impossible. It's just that what knowledge is, materially speaking, is not this, like, formally consistent, like, procedural certainty. It's just not what it is. What it is this, like, very sort of creatively styled, like, exploratory procedure. And again, that's not to say that knowledge cannot be scientific. You just have to abandon the sense of scientific that it is that, like, purely logical, consistent, blah, 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 because that's not what science is. Because science is to do with reality more than anything. And reality and knowledge of reality grounded in reality is not like that and cannot be. So that cannot be what science is. So yes, this is this weird dichotomy of equally failed cultural figures, which I think is immensely clarified by this bipolar, by these terms. Hello? So now taking these together, Parmenidesizing and quilting, so this is the rhythm of reason, when there's a singular, like, connected flow of both tendencies. And now in most cases, what it means to say this is an existent thing, this rhythm, is actually a matter of saying that this is the organically arising flow of conversation between multiple agents, which is true. Between multiple agents that fail to understand each other, or may even be, like, theatrically misinforming each other or manipulating each other, they organically play out a unified process of Parmenidesization. And there's an atmosphere of complexity arising out of these agents coming together from different perspectives. But this is never the end of investigation. I mean, that can be the end of, like, some conversation if you just trail off, I guess. But in any, like, at all procedurally directed investigation of a particular field, if there's actually a particular question in mind, and it's a good question, inevitably there must be a quilt. There must be a quilt, because to quilt is what takes this field of, like, overwhelming totality and distills it into a particular form which is communicable, perceivable, recognizable. It's utilizable for the human mind in a better way. It's, instead of simply being, I mean, the leftist false ideal of just this overwhelming, impossible to capture sense of all and every blah blah blah. raw complexity. Instead, you have, in order to actually like have direction as such, in order for like authoritative statement to exist at all, to be like, this is the point to be made here, as opposed to any other point. There has to be a quilting point. There has to be this successful distillation. And so among multiple agents of various schools of thought or whatever, this can happen spontaneously. This may even happen sort of like through an overlapping like procedure of different agents making different points and then noticing different things about each other, and then it just sort of happens that like certain ideas come together in a way that forms the quilt that none of the particular agents were capable of actually imposing. It can happen that way, and in actual fact, more often than not, that is the way it occurs. And I would say, to be honest, this is why people don't generally have a good sense that this is just the general rhythm of like procedurally going through reason, is because it's not usual to have like an individually tethered like engulfing of this total motion, because it's sort of happening beyond the individual more often than not. But so obviously an individual can display the total motion, and actually that is essentially how to recognize a master of a given field, is that they will do this. They will, because this is the form as such of teaching. Is to Parmenidesize and to quilt. It can never be to successfully teach to merely like consistently reveal. There has to be this procedural, like sort of overwhelming part. You have to like sort of throw the student into the deep end, and then out of that complexity you have to sort of like incept in them the sense that there is in fact a real way out that that takes one from this impossible complexity to a precise clarity. To successfully teach, you have to follow this procedure. If you don't follow this procedure, then you don't really teach. You sort of merely just info dump. You at best brainwash. So you probably merely info dump, which is just like, here's this fact, here's this fact, here's a blah, 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 blah. And perhaps you manage to brainwash, which is like sort of in a manipulative sense, you like go, blah, blah, is a fact, is a fact, is a fact. But then after a fact, here's the insight. But you do it in such a way that doesn't rely upon and like nurture the learner's subjective sense of reality taking that direction. That's what it means to brainwash, essentially, is that you just sort of herd. You herd a subject through an apparent inevitability, and therefore create the fabric of a network of information flow where they will just like regurgitate a particular appearance of reason. But reality is a thing, and knowledge is possible, and teaching is possible. And what it means to really teach is not like that. What it means to really teach is rather to Parmenidesize effectively, which is to throw the learner in the deep end, to get them lost. They must be lost. You must make sure they are lost. You must prove to them that they are lost. They must know that there is no way out. And only once they know that there is no way out, you must manifest within them, according to their own sense, this is the way out. And then they have to follow that way out by their own sense of necessity. They have to necessarily unveil the clarity. And that's what it means to teach, because what that means is that you have created the environmental conditions such that they organically discover reality. And to do this, you must Parmenidesize, and then you must impose Parmenidesization. You Parmenidesize them, but then if you're teaching, what you do is you invoke quilting from them. You make them quilt it. That's what it really means to teach. But anyway, that was a bit of a tangent. But if you're reading any master, if you're reading someone who's just like really authoritative on a subject, and they're not strictly talking to particular persons, they are rather just sort of speaking generally, but like in an essay format or something. Like they're speaking like to the public as such, but in a particular directed manner with a particular sort of point, a flow of argumentation. What they will do there is they Parmenidesize and then they just quilt directly. Like they lay out the sort of the game of how it appears as such that this is overwhelmingly complex and there's no way out. But then they just reveal, they unveil that the whole time there was this clarity. And there's a deeply retroactive character to this then, when it's being sort of just given to you as a whole by a master of a subject. So yes, more than anything, this is obvious when you're actually reading someone who's the master of a subject. They just will follow this pattern. Now, they won't necessarily within investigation, because that's too organic. They are like what it means to be investigating is to be within the Parmenidesizing process, and that means that by necessity you don't necessarily have all the threads in order for the quilting point to emerge. You're still finding the threads. You're still realizing certain threads are connected. So it's chaotic. Investigation is being within chaos. But if someone has finalized an insight, and if someone is unveiling that insight, then the Parmenidesization is specifically mere appearance. Because they are just effectively revealing to you that essentially that the insight as such by the end is not the mere rightist false ideal of just like oversimplistic, just mere statement. They have to like rigorously contextualize it to make sure that you understand that this is the conclusion of a clarifying procedure. Okay, so reading a master on a subject follows this flow. Very poignantly, very directly, very pungently. It's clearly like this. And not just in mere education, not just in like telling you information, but like any just directed description is like this. It has to be, because this is the rhythm of reason as such, in a dialectical sense, not in the sense of like I was saying, it's not just formal logic, it's like in the Hegelian sense of reason being the motion of the world. And of course reason is really, the self-conscious, like procedural self-grounding of a particular human essence within that motion, but one does so according to like discovering and following the necessity of the flow of the world itself. This is why Hegel is material in form. But yeah, so basically, it's not just fucking essays. It's like a particular, like, directed component of a novel will be like this. If you read a good, like, just bit of literature, and it has a good particular part where there's a particular point being made, or a particular just mise en scène being expressed that's like just effectively engulfing you. How that flows is like this. It overwhelms you. It creates an appearance of impossibly diverse sensibilities. It sort of creates an aesthetic chaos. And then out of that, which is the only conditions under which such is possible, there emerges true clarity. Because what clarity is essentially this quilting procedure. It is this successful...
Illegal.
It is this point at which the totality is unveiled to have been unified utterly. So, I say so too much. So a novel can be like that, and like a film can be like that, and like any sort of like very directed, consciously unified component of art can be like that, can just like clearly manifest the total flow of this rhythm. Parmenides you and quilts you. But obviously art isn't just all like that. But I still think art can, in a sort of general sense, be more effectively apprehended with this sort of theoretical tool set in mind. Because what other art will do is, because this is the rhythm of reason itself, reason being the motion of the world itself, it being a real thing, and art is this way that that being human apprehends reality. It's a form of communication, and therefore it's communicating reality. So still one can understand different bits of art better with this in mind. It's just that, like, what some art might do is, sort of one or the other, in a sense. It might sort of... So what would it be to sort of merely Parmenidesize is obviously sort of to just overwhelm, complexify, but, not... Because it's not in a strictly rational environment, that's not like a fallacy. It's just like that's effectively conveying a very real sort of part of living, is to be within that component of the rhythm. And then the inverse, it could merely sort of be quilting without effectively Parmenidesizing. What that would be is like maybe to just sort of like drop you within a very given totality without rigorously contextualizing, and then to just sort of like give you that punch. And I mean, this is where I'm sure the fallacy in reality comes from, is having the sense that those are the clarifying moments within like a narrative. But again, in art, this isn't a fallacy. In art, this is just like effectively communicating a sense of a part of living, where you sometimes a sort of given narrative structure of reality flows from a point at which the complexity is a given. So it's a perfectly valid sensibility to explore aesthetically. But then also, art can work through like a false version of this. Like you can effectively communicate a sort of emotional totality through like not doing the rhythm of reason. But like when that happens, what it does is like what's meaningful about it is is that you know, being grounded in reality as such, that this is like taken at face value false, and that there's like a point to the irony of this false representation. It speaks to the true rhythm by like presenting on the surface this like mere bad representation of it, but like in the context of you by living have the real rhythm, and then it is alongside that. So anyway, so all this is crazy abstract. I want to do a whole fucking thing about art. I'll probably talk about all sorts of shit like that. Anyway, but so that's all of that's just a tangent to say that, like, because I talked a lot about how this rhythm is clear within like education, like within learning, because that's sort of obviously the realm of reason. But I just wanted to like talk a little about how like reason isn't just like this like merely like purely rational thing, that it is this worldly sense, and that therefore more worldly endeavors still find this rhythm relevant. I think that's pretty much all the ways in which I wanted to talk about those terms right now. As usual, I didn't have sort of a singular point in mind exactly. I just sort of want to lay that out. Oh, what are you doing? Come here. Mainly because going forward, I'm going to use those words, perhaps. And quilting is not the most known thing in the world, and Parmenides-izing is something I made up.